"You'll never make it without me," he sneered at her. But what she did next left the millionaire stunned. A woman, trapped in a marriage of appearances, finally breaks free by filing for divorce from her millionaire husband. He mocks her and vows she'll never survive on her own. Fueled by his taunts, she embarks on a journey of transformation, turning long-forgotten dreams into a thriving brand that takes the market by storm. As her star rises, his world begins to crumble. When their paths cross again, a twist of fate brings the past and present face to face. Can love be reborn from the ashes of what once was? Subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell to stay updated and never miss these stories. The Santoro Mansion in Greenwich, Connecticut, was a true fortress of luxury. Surrounded by immaculate gardens and towering trees, it looked untouchable, almost like a medieval castle full of secrets. The silence was broken only by the rustling of leaves in the wind and, inside the house, by the echoing footsteps of Lucia Santoro. Every corner of that house, from the crystal chandeliers to the Italian marble, reminded her of a life that seemed perfect to outsiders but was suffocating her from within. Lucia stopped by the main living room window, a giant frame of glass showcasing the garden like a painting. Outside, her children, Emma and Lucas, played carefree. Emma, with her almost maternal posture, made sure Lucas didn't fall as he ran after a ball. Lucia watched the scene, her heart heavy. She knew their childhood was being shaped amidst a crumbling marriage. The mansion could shield them from the cold of winter, but not from the coldness reigning between her and Fernando. Fernando Santoro was in the adjacent room, settled into his favorite custom-made Italian leather armchair. He read the newspaper with the focus of someone who seemed to ignore the world around him completely. It was always like this. Fernando treated the people around him as decorative pieces, objects meant to stay in their places and never disrupt his peace. For years, Lucia had accepted that role. But not anymore. She walked into the room with determined steps. Her heart pounded, but her mind was clear. After many sleepless nights, Lucia had finally decided she couldn't live this way anymore. The moment she had postponed for so long had come. "Fernando, I need to talk to you." He didn't look up from the paper, turning a page with infuriating calm. "Fernando," she insisted, her voice gaining strength. He finally raised his eyes, frowning with irritation. "What now, Lucia?" he asked, as if she were a child about to ask a silly question. She took a deep breath, her words coming out with a mix of firmness and vulnerability. "I want a divorce." Fernando remained silent for a moment, processing her words. Then he laughed. It was a low, disdainful laugh, as if she had just told the most absurd joke he had ever heard. "Divorce?" he said, leaning back in his chair and crossing his legs. "Lucia, be reasonable. How are you going to live? And these kids? No one's going to want you with 2 kids to raise, and honestly, without me, you've got nothing." The words cut like knives, but this time, Lucia didn't back down. Years ago, she might have cried, begged, or even reconsidered. But the weight of years of disdain and humiliation had made something new grow within her. Strength. "I'd rather have nothing and build something than keep living as your prisoner," she replied, looking him straight in the eyes. Fernando raised an eyebrow, surprised by her response. It was the first time in a long while that Lucia had dared to confront him this way. He tried to mask his surprise with more sarcasm. "Do whatever you want. Just don't come crawling back when you realize the world out there has no place for you." Lucia swallowed her anger, refusing to fall into his provocation. Without another word, She turned and walked out of the room, leaving Fernando behind, still chuckling softly. As she walked through the mansion's corridors for the last time, she felt a mix of fear and relief. That night, as she packed her belongings in the massive closet, Lucia realized how much of her life had been consumed by that house and Fernando. Her dreams from youth, her creativity as a fashion designer. Everything seemed lost among designer shoes and expensive dresses she had never truly chosen. Opening a forgotten shelf high up, she found a wooden box. Inside were sketchbooks she hadn't seen in years. Each page was a memory of who she had been before marriage. Lucia held the drawings, feeling a wave of nostalgia and sadness. But along with those emotions, something else emerged. A spark of hope. She closed her suitcases, called Emma and Lucas, and together they crossed the mansion's front door. The cold night enveloped them, but the warmth of Lucia's decision kept them steady. As the mansion's lights faded into the distance, Lucia looked up at the starry sky and murmured to herself, "This is the beginning of something new. The ending of this story will surprise you. Want to find out what happens next? Subscribe now to the channel and share it with anyone who needs a dose of inspiration." The taxi sped through the streets of Greenwich, moving further and further away from the mansion that had once been home to Lucia and her children. Emma and Lucas sat beside her, silent but confused. They didn't understand why they were leaving behind the life they knew, and Lucia knew that sooner or later, she'd have to answer their tough questions. They arrived in Stamford just before midnight. The apartment Lucia had rented was small and simple, with peeling white walls and basic furniture that came with the lease. It was nothing like the luxury they were used to, but there was something about the space that the mansion had never offered. A sense of a fresh start. While Emma explored the new bedroom, Lucas looked at his mother with curious eyes. "Mom, are we going to stay here forever?" he asked, clutching his teddy bear tightly. Lucia smiled, kneeling to his level. "We're going to stay here for a while, sweetheart. This is our new home, and we'll make it into a special place." Her words sounded more confident than she actually felt, but Lucia knew she had to project strength so her children could feel it too. After tucking them into bed, she sat alone in the small living room, surrounded by boxes and suitcases. The silence of the night enveloped her, bringing a mix of relief and fear. The next morning, Lucia woke up early, determined to get her new life in motion. After dropping Emma and Lucas off at school, she decided to explore the neighborhood. The streets of Stamford were very different from the exclusivity of Greenwich. There were small bakeries, corner markets, and people rushing to work. It was a more common reality, but at the same time more authentic. She passed by a small art supply store, and something caught her eye. Colorful fabrics displayed in the window. They weren't the luxurious fabrics she used to admire in New York, but they were vibrant, full of life. She walked into the store, drawn by curiosity. "Can I help you?" asked a familiar voice. Lucia looked up and saw Clara, her college friend. They hadn't seen each other in years, but Clara was unmistakable. Curly hair tied in a messy bun, a warm smile, and sparkling eyes. "Clara!" Lucia exclaimed, surprised and emotional. "Lucia, what are you doing here? I thought you were still living that magazine cover life in Greenwich." Lucia gave a shy smile and explained the essentials. The divorce, the move, and her desire to start over. Clara listened attentively, without interrupting, and when she finished, she gave Lucia a tight hug. "You're stronger than you think," Clara said. "You know what this reminds me of? Those amazing sketches you used to do. Do you still draw?" Lucia hesitated for a moment, thinking of the wooden box she'd found in the closet. It's been a long time since I've drawn anything, but I still have a few ideas. Perfect. Then let's bring them back to life. Clara led Lucia to one of the tables at the back of the store, where fabrics, pencils, and sketchbooks were scattered. The space was chaotic but inspiring. Lucia picked up a pencil hesitantly, feeling almost like an imposter. But as soon as she started tracing the first lines, something magical happened. She sketched for hours, losing track of time. When she finished, she had created 3 designs for children's clothing, all inspired by Emma and Lucas. Clara watched in awe. You've still got it, Lucia. That spark never went out. On her way back home, Lucia felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Excitement. For the first time, the possibility of a different future felt real. That night, as she reviewed the sketches at the kitchen table, Emma walked in, carrying her coloring book. Mom, can I draw too? Lucia smiled, pulling a chair out for her daughter. Of course, sweetheart. Let's create together. As mother and daughter worked side by side, Lucas joined them, bringing his colorful markers. The scene was simple but full of meaning. For the first time, Lucia felt like she was building something genuine, not just for herself but for her children. Click subscribe so you don't miss a moment of this incredible journey, and share it with anyone who loves a good twist. In the days that followed, Lucia threw herself into bringing her sketches to life. Clara was her greatest ally, lending her fabrics and tools from the store to help her take her first steps. The small apartment's kitchen became an improvised atelier, with threads, needles, and scraps of fabric scattered across the table. Lucia sewed late into the night while her children slept, savoring every quiet moment to create. Her first pieces were simple but full of personality. Inspired by the designs she'd made for Emma and Lucas, she created children's dresses with delicate prints and handmade details. Each piece seemed to tell a story. Despite her doubts and fears, Lucia felt like she was finally building something with her own hands. Clara, ever enthusiastic, suggested Lucia participate in the local craft fair, a weekly event where small entrepreneurs showcased their work. At first, Lucia hesitated. What if no one buys anything? She thought. But Clara, with her contagious energy, refused to take no for an answer. Lucia, everyone starts somewhere. If you don't show the world what you do, how do you expect people to see what you're capable of? The fair took place on a sunny Saturday. Lucia arrived early to set up her booth, using a white cloth and some makeshift hangers to display the dresses. Emma and Lucas were by her side, helping organize the pieces. Though her hands trembled, Lucia stood tall. "Mom, someone's coming," said Emma, pointing at the first group of visitors. A woman approached and carefully examined one of the dresses. "This is beautiful," she said, smiling. "Do you make everything by hand?" "Yes," Lucia replied, trying to hide her nerves. "Each piece is made with great care." By the end of the day, Lucia had sold nearly all the dresses. Emma and Lucas celebrated by jumping with joy around the booth. But for Lucia, the real triumph was realizing that her work had value, something Fernando had always dismissed. The biggest surprise came the following week when a local influencer posted a photo of her daughter wearing one of Lucia's dresses. The post went viral, leading to a flood of messages and orders. Lucia was astonished when she opened her phone and saw the notifications pouring in. "You're becoming famous," joked Clara, watching the numbers climb. Despite her excitement, Lucia felt the weight of responsibility. She needed to find a way to handle the orders without compromising the quality of her work or her routine with her children. It was a new challenge, but one she was determined to tackle. Meanwhile, Fernando began hearing rumors about Lucia's success. Mutual friends mentioned a promising designer who was gaining attention in town. He, who had always believed she couldn't survive without him, felt a pang of discomfort. That evening, while reviewing his company's financial reports, Fernando opened social media and searched for Lucia's name. He found photos of her creations and comments full of praise. For the first time, he realized he might have underestimated his wife. Fernando felt his pride take a hit, but what unsettled him most was the thought that she could thrive without him, while his own life was beginning to show cracks. Lucia's days were long but filled with purpose. She divided her time between taking care of her children, organizing orders in her atelier, and dreaming about the next step. The name New Beginnings was starting to spread through Stamford, drawing attention. Customers who had initially come out of curiosity were now recommending her to their friends, and the small brand was beginning to take on a life of its own. Meanwhile, Fernando Santoro lived in stark contrast. What had once been his financial empire was crumbling. Tense meetings with shareholders had become routine, and investors made no effort to hide their frustrations. At night, in his silent mansion, Fernando sat alone, surrounded by the luxury that had once been his armor but now felt hollow. A sudden message from a colleague pulled him out of his thoughts. "I saw your ex-wife at the small business event. Looks like she's doing well." Who knew she had talent for that? Fernando felt his face heat up. The idea of Lucia being praised and thriving without him seemed impossible. He didn't believe it. It must be something small, insignificant, he thought. But, driven by restless curiosity, he opened social media and typed her name. What he saw left him speechless. Photos of Lucia's creations flooded the screen, accompanied by hundreds of glowing comments. Happy customers, budding partnerships, and even posts featuring the New Beginnings logo painted a picture he struggled to comprehend. Lucia was building something he had deemed impossible. Fernando slammed his phone shut, trying to contain his irritation. She won't be able to sustain this for long, he thought, unwilling to accept her success. But deep down, one question gnawed at him. What if she really doesn't need me anymore? The next morning, Fernando decided to confront her. He got into his sports car and drove to Stamford, ignoring the discomfort of being outside the luxurious bubble he was used to. When he arrived at the atelier's address, he saw a simple sign that read "New Beginnings" and paused, observing the activity inside. Inside, Lucia was putting the finishing touches on a dress, while Clara organized fabrics at the counter. The space was warm and lively, with mannequins displaying outfits and a bulletin board decorated with drawings by Emma and Lucas. The place radiated authenticity, something Fernando had never valued but now felt like a direct affront to his controlled, artificial world. He entered without warning, the sound of the door catching Lucia's attention. When she saw him, her eyes narrowed. "Fernando, what are you doing here?" Clara stopped what she was doing, eyeing him with suspicion. "I came to see how you're doing," he said with feigned casualness, letting his gaze wander around the space. "I heard you're working." Lucia crossed her arms, standing firm. "I am. And it seems you've also heard that it's going well." Fernando laughed, but it sounded forced. "Let's be realistic, Lucia. This is interesting, but do you really think it'll last? Making dresses in a tiny space?" Clara, unable to hold back, shot back. I didn't know you were so interested in hard work, Fernando. Doesn't seem like your style. He ignored Clara, locking his eyes on Lucia. Listen, Lucia, I know you're trying something new, but don't you think you're fooling yourself? Why don't you drop this and come back to Greenwich? We can talk. Lucia blinked, incredulous. Come back? For what, Fernando? To be your shadow again? To hear you tell me I'm not good enough? I didn't say that, he snapped, now visibly irritated. I'm just saying it might be better to focus on something more secure. The business world isn't for everyone, especially not for someone without experience. His words ignited something inside Lucia. For years, she'd heard those same criticisms, those subtle attempts to undermine her confidence. But this time was different. This time she knew he was wrong. You still think you can manipulate me, don't you? Lucia said, her voice filled with emotion. I built this. Every piece, every customer, every compliment. And you know what's best? I did it all without you. Fernando tried to interrupt, but she didn't give him the chance. For years, you made me believe I was nothing without you. But you know what, Fernando? I've discovered I'm so much more than you ever thought I was. The silence that followed was crushing. Fernando looked around, as if searching for something to say, but found only the truth in Lucia's eyes. She was no longer the woman he could control. Finally, he sighed and stepped back. Good luck with this, Lucia. Let's see how far you can go. Lucia didn't reply. She simply watched him leave, while Clara muttered from the background, "That man is unbelievable." When the door closed, Lucia took a deep breath. There was no sadness or doubt, only the certainty that she had chosen the right path. Let's get back to work, she said with a determined smile. The atelier door slammed shut, and the sound echoed in Fernando's ears, a harsh reminder that he was no longer in control. The humiliation he felt from Lucia's words followed him to his car. He sank into the leather seat, taking a deep breath, but the tightness in his chest refused to fade. It was as if his pride was slowly crumbling, and he had no idea how to handle it. As he drove back to Greenwich, Fernando tried to rationalize what had just happened. She's making a mistake, he thought. Lucia doesn't have the experience or the understanding of how the real world works. She'll fail and realize she needs me, but deep down, something else gnawed at him. The unsettling possibility that she might actually succeed without him. When he arrived at the mansion, the house was eerily quiet. None of the staff were in sight, and the emptiness of the space seemed to mirror the state of his life. He sat on the living room sofa, the same one where he had so often ignored Lucia while reading the newspaper. Now, the newspaper lay untouched on the table, and he had no energy to open it. His thoughts wandered to the past, to the early years of their marriage. Lucia had been different then. There was a lightness to her, a natural joy he had gradually extinguished. She admired him, supported his decisions, and bent over backward to please him. But at some point, he had begun treating her like furniture, something useful but devoid of its own life. Fernando closed his eyes, trying to push away the growing guilt. It's not my fault, he told himself. She was always fragile. Yet, as he recalled Lucia's firm stance at the atelier, he realized how wrong he had been. She wasn't fragile. He was. Back at the atelier, Lucia was trying to focus on her work, but the encounter with Fernando lingered in her mind. His words echoed, attempting to breach the wall of confidence she had built. Let's see how far you can go. He doesn't have that power over you anymore, she murmured to herself, adjusting the hem of a dress. Clara noticed her unusual silence and approached. "Want to talk about it?" she asked gently, her tone that of someone who understood exactly what was happening. Lucia shook her head but then sighed, setting the fabric down. "He thinks this is temporary, that I'm going to fail and crawl back to him." Clara crossed her arms, a wry smile playing on her lips. "Of course he thinks that. Men like Fernando live in a world where no one can thrive without them. But you've already proven him wrong." Lucia remained silent for a moment, letting her friend's words sink in. "I know. It's just, sometimes I still feel like I'm fighting him, even though he's not in my life anymore." Clara placed a comforting hand on Lucia's shoulder. "That's part of the process. But in the end, the only opinion that matters is yours. And look at what you've built." Lucia smiled, feeling the tension ease. Clara always had a way of bringing clarity to things. While Lucia strengthened her resolve, Fernando faced the start of a real crisis. His company was on the brink of losing a multimillion-dollar contract due to poor management, and shareholders were growing increasingly impatient. The man once seen as an unshakable leader was now being questioned by everyone around him. During a tense meeting with top investors, Fernando struggled to maintain his confident facade, but every question felt like an accusation. "Mr. Santoro, how do you plan to address the deficit in the next quarter?" one of the directors asked sharply. "We're working on recovery strategies," Fernando replied, though even he didn't believe his own words. After the meeting, he locked himself in his office and spent hours staring at charts and numbers that made no sense. For the first time, he felt something he would never admit: fear. Deep down, Fernando knew the problem wasn't just the company. It was him. For years, he had relied on the image of perfection he projected, but now that facade was crumbling. Meanwhile, Lucia was on the brink of a significant milestone. A satisfied client had recommended her brand to a local magazine, which invited her for an interview. It was a golden opportunity to showcase her work, but it also made her nervous. "I've never done an interview before," Lucia confessed to Clara as she reviewed the reporter's questions. "You'll be amazing," Clara assured her. "Just speak from the heart." On the day of the interview, Lucia prepared carefully. She wore one of her own designs, a simple yet elegant dress, and brought some of her best-selling pieces to display. The interview took place in the atelier, and the reporter, a young, enthusiastic woman, seemed genuinely interested in Lucia's story. The name New Beginnings is very symbolic. "How did it come about?" the reporter asked. "It represents what I was going through," Lucia explained. "After years in a stifling marriage, I decided to start over. Every piece I create reflects that journey of transformation." The sincerity in Lucia's words moved the reporter, who promised to dedicate a special section to her story. When the interview was published, it had an immediate impact. New customers began to pour in, and invitations to fairs and events multiplied. Fernando, on the other hand, learned about the interview from a friend. He read every word carefully, feeling a mix of pride and resentment. Lucia spoke of transformation, strength, and independence, qualities he had never acknowledged in her. Instead of reflecting on his own arrogance, Fernando clung to the belief that Lucia was destined to fail. He decided to confront her again, this time with a plan, to make her give up before she faced what he deemed the inevitable. He arrived at the atelier late one busy afternoon, finding Lucia exhausted but satisfied with her day. When she saw him, her smile immediately faded. "What do you want now, Fernando?" she asked, crossing her arms. He walked in uninvited, scanning the space with an air of superiority. I just wanted to see how you're managing all this. Seems like you're doing well. But have you thought about what you'll do when things slow down? Lucia rolled her eyes. Let me guess. You're here to warn me that I'm going to fail? Fernando tried to soften his tone, but his intent was clear. I'm saying the market is tough. You're taking risks you don't understand. I understand enough to know I don't need you, Lucia shot back. And honestly, Fernando, I don't know why you keep trying. For the first time, he was speechless. As he left, the emptiness inside him felt greater than ever. Fernando returned to his mansion, but the house felt darker than ever. He walked down the corridor where old photos of his marriage to Lucia still hung. For years, he had ignored them, but now his eyes lingered. In one photo, taken during their honeymoon, Lucia's radiant smile shone, as if the world was hers to conquer. It was a stark contrast to the woman he had met at the atelier. Confident, but hardened by scars he had caused. He sank into the leather armchair in the living room, staring into the darkness. The arrogance that had always defined him now felt like a burden. For the first time, Fernando wondered what might have happened if he had supported Lucia from the beginning. Perhaps she wouldn't have left. Perhaps he wouldn't be alone. Yet even as these thoughts surfaced, his pride held him back. He tried to convince himself that Lucia was merely lucky, that sooner or later reality would catch up to her. But deep down, he was beginning to see her success as something more enduring, something he couldn't control. The next day, while reviewing documents for his declining company, Fernando received a call from one of his lawyers. Mr. Santoro, we need to discuss the divorce. Lucia has filed a formal request to expedite the process, and I recommend we don't drag this out. Fernando was silent for a moment. He had known this was coming, but hearing it made his stomach churn. Fine, he said, trying to sound indifferent. Handle it. When he hung up, he realized he was officially losing Lucia, not just emotionally but legally. She was moving forward while he remained stuck in the past. At the atelier, Lucia's days were more intense than ever. The local magazine interview had brought a surge of new clients, and New Beginnings was gaining recognition as a sustainable and artisanal fashion brand. Clara, now officially helping with the business, was always by Lucia's side, offering ideas and support. Did you know there's a sustainable fashion event in New York next month? Clara said while organizing orders. New York? Clara, that's huge. I don't know if I'm ready for something like that. Not only are you ready, Lucia, but you're going to shine. It's the natural next step. Lucia hesitated but knew Clara was right. It was a big risk but also an opportunity to take her brand to the next level. That night, after putting Emma and Lucas to bed, she sat at the kitchen table and began sketching a new collection. The lines flowed effortlessly, each design reflecting her journey. Elegant yet practical dresses, vibrant children's pieces, and even accessories that celebrated personal transformation. Lucia felt completely immersed in her creativity, as if she were shaping not just clothing but her identity. Meanwhile, Fernando was grappling with isolation. With each meeting, the pressure mounted. Investors were tired of excuses, and the contracts he relied on to sustain his company continued to slip through his fingers. One of his oldest partners, who had always supported him, finally confronted him during a meeting. Fernando, you need to accept that your leadership style doesn't work anymore. People have changed, the market has changed, and you're still stuck in the past. The words hit hard. Fernando had always prided himself on being relentless, but now he realized the world around him no longer tolerated it. After the meeting, he returned to his office, spending hours staring at papers, paralyzed by indecision. The week of the New York event arrived. Lucia was nervous but excited. She carefully packed pieces from her new collection and set up a booth that reflected the essence of new beginnings. The event's halls buzzed with energy, with emerging designers showcasing their creations and buyers evaluating products. Lucia observed it all, feeling small compared to the grandeur of the event but determined to do her best. Visitors began to approach her booth. One of the first to compliment her work was an editor from a renowned children's fashion magazine. "Your pieces are unique," the editor said, holding one of the dresses. "I'd like to schedule a meeting to discuss a potential collaboration." Lucia could barely contain her excitement. She knew this opportunity could change everything. While Lucia was experiencing a peak in her journey, Fernando reached his breaking point. His company was on the brink of bankruptcy, and he knew his reputation was at stake. For the first time, he considered something unthinkable: asking for help. He picked up the phone and dialed Lucia's number. "What do you want, Fernando?" she asked, her tone tired but not hostile. He hesitated, feeling the weight of the words he needed to say. "I need to talk, not about business or us. I just need to understand where I went wrong." Lucia was silent for a moment. She knew Fernando wasn't the type to admit vulnerability, and that made her consider her response carefully. "Fine, we can talk, but understand that this doesn't change anything between us." "I understand," Fernando replied, his sincerity surprising her. When they met, the conversation was unlike any they had ever had before. Fernando wasn't there to manipulate or persuade Lucia. For the first time, he was willing to listen. "I ruined everything, didn't I?" he asked, breaking the silence. "Yes, Fernando, you destroyed a lot. But at the same time, you gave me something I never would have had if I stayed by your side. The freedom to be who I truly am." Fernando looked at her, feeling the weight of her words. He couldn't undo the past, but for the first time, he was ready to accept his mistakes and find a way to move forward, even if it was without her. The cafe where Lucia and Fernando met was simple and quiet, a stark contrast to the luxurious settings he was accustomed to. She arrived on time, wearing a dress she had designed, a silent declaration of her new life. Fernando was already there, seated by the window, staring into space with a distant expression. When he saw her enter, he stood up, visibly nervous. "Thank you for coming," he said, attempting a smile. "I don't know what you want, Fernando, but I hope this is quick. My time is precious now," Lucia replied, sitting down. Fernando swallowed hard. There was something different about her, a confidence he didn't recognize, and it intimidated him. "I needed to see you. I needed to say I'm sorry for everything I did." Lucia crossed her arms, studying him intently. "You're sorry?" she repeated, her tone laced with disbelief. "Fernando, for years you treated me like I was invisible, like my dreams and opinions didn't matter. You thought I was incapable, weak. And now that I've proven you wrong, you come here with apologies?" Fernando lowered his gaze. He knew he deserved every word. "I know I can't change the past," he began quietly. "But the truth is, I was wrong. I thought keeping you dependent on me was the best way to control our life, but now I see I only destroyed something good." Lucia took a deep breath, feeling a mix of anger and compassion. "Fernando, I've learned to set myself free, but you need to learn to face your own failures. What happened between us can't be fixed, and I don't want to relive it." Fernando nodded slowly, as if each word was a blow he knew he needed to take. "I understand. I just hope that one day you can forgive me." The silence that followed was heavy, but Lucia finally broke it with a sigh. "Forgiveness isn't something you get right away, Fernando. Takes time. Maybe someday I'll get there." After their conversation, Fernando began to deeply reflect on his life. He decided to sell the mansion in Greenwich and move into a smaller, simpler home. The decision was not only a financial necessity but also a symbolic gesture of leaving behind the man he used to be. Fernando started a new project, offering consulting services to small businesses in need of guidance. He used his years of experience to help entrepreneurs avoid the mistakes he had made. It wasn't glamorous, but it was meaningful, and for the first time he felt like he was doing something with purpose. Meanwhile, Lucia was at the height of her journey. After the success of the New York event, her brand began attracting interest from stores across the state. Clara, now officially her business partner, helped coordinate orders and manage the atelier's growing team. One afternoon, while adjusting a new dress, Emma ran into the room holding a colorful drawing. "Mom, I made a logo for you." Lucia smiled, taking the paper where a heart formed by stitching lines was drawn. "It's perfect, sweetheart. We'll use it for our next collection." Not wanting to be outdone, Lucas brought a box filled with ribbons and fabrics he had helped organize. "I helped too, Mom." Lucia embraced them, moved. Her children weren't just part of her life, they were part of her story. Everything she had built was for them and because of them. One evening, while reviewing the company's numbers with Clara, Lucia received an unexpected message on her phone. It was from Fernando. "Congratulations on your success. You deserve it." She stared at the screen for a moment before replying, "Thank you. I hope you find what you're looking for too." The brief exchange was a sign that, perhaps, they were both finally accepting their new paths. Years later, Lucia stood on the stage of a women's entrepreneurship conference. She spoke to a packed audience, sharing her story of resilience and transformation. "When I started, I was terrified of failing," she said. "But what I've learned is that failure isn't the opposite of success. It's part of the journey. Every mistake taught me something. Every obstacle made me stronger." The audience gave her a standing ovation, and Lucia smiled, emotional. Emma and Lucas were in the front row, beaming with pride at the mother who had become an inspiration to so many. Backstage, Clara approached with a smile. "You nailed it, as always. I couldn't have done any of this without you," Lucia replied, hugging her friend. Meanwhile, in a nearby town, Fernando watched the event's broadcast on television. He smiled, not with regret but with a sense of peace. He had finally come to terms with the fact that Lucia had found what he had never been able to give her: freedom and respect. And so, their stories continued on separate paths, but both found what they needed most: a new beginning. Time passed, and both Lucia and Fernando immersed themselves in their new paths. New Beginnings had become a national success, with Lucia expanding her operations to other states. Fernando, meanwhile, found balance in his simpler life, offering consultancy to small businesses and rebuilding his identity far from the pressures of his former life. Yet, there was something neither could deny. An invisible thread still connected them. It wasn't just because of their children, but something deeper, something both hesitated to acknowledge. Their paths crossed again unexpectedly at a business fair in New York. Lucia had been invited as a keynote speaker, while Fernando, unaware she would be there, attended with a client, a young entrepreneur seeking inspiration. Lucia was on stage, recounting her journey of resilience, when Fernando entered the room. At first, he didn't recognize her, but her voice was unmistakable. Seeing her there, confident and commanding the audience's attention, stirred something in him he hadn't felt in years: admiration. After her talk, Fernando lingered until the crowd began to disperse. Lucia, surrounded by admirers and potential collaborators, didn't notice him at first. When their eyes finally met, her expression shifted, not with anger or discomfort, but cautious surprise. "Fernando," she said as the group around her thinned. "Lucia, you were incredible." She raised an eyebrow, studying him. He seemed different, softer, less arrogant, and more human. "Thank you. What are you doing here?" "I'm here with a client. I didn't know you'd be speaking, but maybe it was fate." She gave a short laugh, crossing her arms. "Fate? That's new coming from you." Fernando smiled, accepting her jab. "I've changed. At least I hope I have." Lucia paused, recalling their last conversation. He had seemed sincere then, but doubts lingered. "Maybe you have, Fernando, but what do you expect from me now?" He took a deep breath, as if preparing for something significant. "I don't expect anything, Lucia. I just wanted to say that, for the first time, I'm truly proud of you. Not because I need to be, but because you deserve it." The words caught Lucia off guard. For years, she had dreamed of hearing something like this from him. But now, having built her success alone, they carried a different weight. "Thank you," she replied, her tone softening. "But pride isn't enough, Fernando." He nodded, acknowledging her point. "I know. That's why I want a chance to show you who I've become. I don't want to fix the past. I know I can't. But maybe we can find a new future." In the following months, Fernando began to rebuild a connection, not through grand gestures, but with small acts of respect and presence. He became more involved in Emma and Lucas's lives, attending their school events and important moments. Lucia watched his transformation cautiously but also with hope. One weekend, during Lucas's birthday party at Lucia's atelier, Fernando was invited to join the celebration. The space buzzed with laughter, creativity, and warmth, the essence of new beginnings. Fernando helped set up the party, carrying boxes of sweets and inflating balloons. Emma and Lucas were thrilled to see him so present, and Lucia couldn't help but smile as she watched him integrate into their world. "You're really trying, aren't you?" she asked as they arranged Lucas's gifts. "For the first time, yes," he replied earnestly. The party was a success, and at the end of the day, as the children played with their new toys, Fernando approached Lucia in the kitchen. "I know it will take time for you to trust me, but I want to keep trying," he said. Lucia looked at him for a long moment before responding. "I don't want you to try, Fernando. I want you to be consistent. It's not about words or promises. It's about actions. And that's what I'll do," he promised. Over the next year, Fernando continued to demonstrate his transformation. He respected Lucia's space but supported her whenever he could. When she needed help expanding her brand, he offered advice without imposing himself. One evening, after a long business meeting, Lucia realized Fernando was becoming more than just the father of her children. He was someone who understood her struggles and deeply admired her. That night, she made a decision. "Fernando, would you like to have dinner here tomorrow? Just the two of us." He was surprised but accepted. The dinner was simple but meaningful. They spoke openly, recalling good memories while acknowledging the mistakes that had driven them apart. For the first time, there was genuine openness between them. Years later, Lucia and Fernando were together again, but as entirely different people. Lucia remained the driving force behind new beginnings, while Fernando dedicated himself to helping others grow. Together, they forged a new dynamic built on mutual respect and admiration. During an interview, Lucia was asked how she balanced her personal life and career. The secret is understanding that true love doesn't confine, it liberates. Fernando and I learned this the hard way, but also in the most valuable way. Their past was marked by mistakes, but their future became an opportunity for reconstruction. And so, they proved that sometimes new beginnings aren't just individual, they can be shared.